is Tara Godoy again. I'm a forensic nurse and I'm based out of Bay Area, California, and I offer testimony on areas such as strangulation and blunt force trauma most frequently. But what I say is when you have medical records, you should give me a call. So today I want to talk to you about bruising and the dating of bruises. I get called on this on a regular basis. The cases in which the victim has bruises, whether it's a child abuse case, a domestic violence or assault case, oftentimes the bruising is used as part of evidence to show that the assault occurred. And the difficulty is that there are still many experts out there that think that bruising can be dated by color. The healthcare providers will document bruises of various colors and stages of healing, or something similar that alludes to the fact that the bruises occurred at different times. The police officers will also document in their police reports that the bruise looked old, or it looks new, or it looks fresh, anything along those lines. As a general rule, you can't date bruises, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about here today. But I wanted to also define the bruise for you. In the medical field, there are two words that are connected with bruising. One is a contusion, which is what you think of as a bruise. It is from blunt force trauma, where the impact of some kind of hard object or some kind of blunt trauma causes the capillaries under the skin to burst, and the blood seeps out into the extracellular space, and that's where you see the discoloration. An ecchymosis, on the other hand, is a bleeding in the area where you see a visible change where you see a visible discoloration. But in the case of an ecchymosis, the trauma is not necessarily directly over that injury, and it may not necessarily be blunt force trauma. So an example of an ecchymosis is when you have a surgery done, and from the trauma of the surgeon opening up your skin and cutting through the tissues, it's going to cut open those blood vessels and cause blood to seep out into the extracellular space. This is especially true in like the abdominal area, where you can't tourniquet the blood vessels. You have to deal with the bleeding as it comes. And so in an ecchymosis, the blood may be coming from a remote area and seeping through the path of least resistance through gravity to the skin, but the discoloration on the skin will definitely appear to be a bruise. And so that's the major difference between an ecchymosis and a contusion. A contusion is from blunt force trauma. An ecchymosis may be from blunt or sharp trauma, and it is just discoloration of the skin relating to the opening of those blood vessels. Now, I will note that in many medical records, I often see the term ecchymosis and contusion interchangeably used, and that's just due to the term ecchymosis is more of a forensic term, or recognized as a forensic term, and they don't necessarily have that type of education in the hospitals. And so many healthcare providers only know that either bruise or contusion, either contusion or ecchymosis both are layman's term called a bruise. So the key point there is, don't necessarily assume that just because it says ecchymosis that it's not from blunt force trauma, or that it says contusion that it's from blunt force trauma. An assessment of the injury and the cause of the injury would be more related to how that might, what the mechanism is. Bruises themselves, so from contusions specifically, are related to the mechanism of injury. So the characteristics of the bruise, the characteristics of the contusion are going to be related to the force of the trauma, where on the body it's located, underlying medical conditions such as tendency to bleed, and the depth of the injury as well. So one of the common questions I get is whether or not there's a certain amount of force behind the bruise, whether it indicates a great amount of force, or whether it could be caused from minor trauma. And there's not really an easy answer to that, but you can use it in relative terms. A bruise on the abdomen where you don't have a bony surface underneath the skin is going to take much more force to cause a bruise than, say, a bruise on your arm where you have a bone that's underlying directly underneath the skin. And so if you think about the mechanism of the bruise, where there's an impact that causes blood vessels to burst, that impact has to have, if you think of blood vessels as little tiny balloons, you're essentially squeezing them and popping them. And so it's much easier to do that when you have a hard surface underneath the object that's impacting it than, say, like I mentioned on the abdomen, where you have a soft surface. So as I mentioned before, you cannot date bruises. There are still many experts out there that will testify and consult and say that bruises can be dated by color, or that a brown bruise is an old bruise, or a red bruise is a fresh bruise. And that's the traditional thought, is that red, blue, and purple are considered to be young bruises, less than 48 hours, and that old bruises are brown, yellow, and green. That those are at least a week old, and that if you see a mixture of bruises, that you see them in between those 2 dates, between 2 and 7 days. But in truth, the science shows that bruises cannot be dated by color. Part of this is because of what I consider to be blue or green or brown or yellow, you might consider to be one of those other colors. So if I think it's yellow, you might think it's green. Also, when you're dealing only with photographs, there is the adjustments that cameras make, and lighting and things such as that. So the first best practice is for healthcare providers and police officers to not document that a bruise is of varying stages of healing based off of the color alone. When I talk about yellow and green and assisting in the aging of bruises, I want to reiterate that what I think is yellow, you might think is brown. What I think is green, you might actually think is blue. And so when it comes to testimony, another best practice is to avoid saying that in this photograph, for example, this particular bruise is yellow or green and therefore must be at least 18 or 24 hours old. And so as a hypothetical, I can discuss the studies here, but having bruises that are up on the screen for the judge or the jury to see, I won't try and date bruises specifically, and I think it's a poor practice to do so. The other critical information about bruises and having them be relevant to like child abuse cases or assault cases is that bruises can be patterned along with other injuries, but bruises specifically can be patterned, and if they are patterned, then the characteristics of the bruise will actually match the object that caused them. Now, to be cautious there, a thumbprint bruise, for example, is just an oval bruise. There are many bruises are circular or oval in nature, and just because it happens to be a similar size to a thumb does not necessarily mean that it is from a thumb. Now, that being said, when you have a thumbprint bruise on your bicep, on the victim's bicep, and then 3 or 4 matching bruises on the back of the arm that match the general shape and size of a hand, because you are taking into account more than one bruise, that is more consistent with, the grabbing mechanism and can be considered a pattern injury. So the one bruise by itself, not necessarily going to be consistent with anything other than just some kind of trauma to the area. But when you take into account 3 or 4 other bruises that match up, then that's when we're talking about what can be more specifically defined as a patterned injury. So I hope you guys learned something today, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.